Welcome to this week's edition of Film Shocks with Hitchcock, my year-long journey with the master of suspense. Today we have yet another double feature. In this case, it's not because one of the films is so not recognized as a Hitchcock film or he had limited involvement in, but we still feel the need to bring it up. It more has to do with the fact that this is a film that was remade in a different language, with different actors, but utilizing the same sets, similar to what they did with Dracula. I know Universal also did it with their 1930 film, The Cat Creeps. They also made a Spanish language version, similar to what they would do with Dracula a year later. But both of those films are lost, the original English version and the Spanish version. So I guess there wasn't a huge push to preserve the multi-language version of any film. Even this copy of Mary that I watched that's available on the 2019 Kino Blu-ray is not in as good of condition as Murder. If I didn't say it before, those are the films we're talking about today. Murder, released in 1930, and Mary, released in 1931, but both filmed at the same time, with Mary utilizing German actors. This is also an interesting case where the same director helmed both productions. I know in the case of Dracula, there's two different directors, there's two different visions. There's a lot of differences in the shot sequences and the way the camera is operated if you watch those films back to back. But with Murder and Mary, since it's the same director, a lot of the shot sequences are pretty much the same. There's not a whole lot of differences between the two versions, but we'll get into that a little later. To begin with, let's discuss Murder. It was actually based on a book titled Enter Sir John. This was written by Clement Stane and Helen Simpson. Helen Simpson would actually be credited on some other Hitchcock productions. Most notably, she wrote the original version of Under Capricorn, which wasn't only adapted by Hitchcock, but as a 1982 film as well. The book itself also had a sequel, which was titled, get this, Re-Enter Sir John. There's not any film adaptations of that, but it'd be kind of interesting if someone went after this character again. I could see this character making reoccurring appearances in other murder mystery whodunit stories, because the way he gets involved in this whodunit is quite interesting. The film doesn't waste any time. It immediately opens with a screaming woman. We see the street react to this as many windows open and the people inside are commenting on what's that screaming. Everybody's going outside. They're going to the house where they find a dead body. There's a bloody wood stove poker on the ground and a woman who's sitting near the body. Everyone's immediate assumption is that it's her. She's in a bit of a daze and the brandy is gone. It's been drank. So everyone assumes clearly this woman must have drank some of that brandy, got into a bit of a confused state, and murdered her friend. They were also arguing over a boy, but a lot of these details aren't figured out until later as the case goes on. In the opening scene, we actually meet a lot of the characters right away. It's a good way to introduce everybody. Everyone's called out by exactly who they are. They point out Ted Markham, who's the stage manager, Diana Baring, who's the one accused of the murder, and everyone is part of a traveling stage show that's been going on. So because one of the actresses is murdered, where the title comes from, and the other actress is accused and brought to jail, the show goes on with other people taking on their roles. The police go to investigate, and they have to do everything behind the stage while the production is going on. This is a pretty great setup, actually. A lot of the characters have to keep popping in and out because they have to go back on stage. We don't ever see what they're performing, but we get some glimpses of it from the side. They find out some details about the characters, but for the most part, there's not any evidence that Diana isn't the murderer. It makes the most sense that she committed it, given that they were fighting just before the murder happened. We then cut to the courtroom, and that's when we meet Sir John. Sir John is played by Herbert Marshall. What's interesting about him is I guess he lost a leg during the First World War. Clearly he's able to use some prosthetic, but honestly I didn't even notice that there was a prosthetic being used. I never realized that he was missing a leg. It makes sense why there's an extended sequence of him in a bed. It also makes sense that he doesn't have many other credits in Hitchcock films. This is his only one. He did do some voiceover work for a lot of the radio productions of Hitchcock films, and Hitchcock himself had nothing but good words to say about him in the Truffaut book. Essentially, after that, we take on a 12 Angry Men type of scenario where the jury is deliberating on the case. The only one who really has the sense that they're not guilty is Sir John. Sir John actually knows Diana previously. Sir John himself is an actor, and he convinced Diana to join the traveling theater, which is what's making him feel guilty. He feels that he got Diana into this position. He also doesn't believe that she could commit that murder. A lot of people have that understanding, but they can't get past any of the evidence. It just doesn't make sense that anybody else could have murdered this woman. There's not enough reasonable doubt. Sir John arrives home after the verdict is read, and he learns over the radio that she is sentenced to death. While listening to the radio, he starts contemplating his own thoughts on the matter, and realizes that the brandy may come into play more than he originally thought. You see, Diana herself isn't sure if she committed the murder. She was in a daze. She says, "It's absolutely possible that I did murder her," but she never says she drank the brandy, which is kind of the big reason as to why everyone thought she'd be in a daze, that she was drinking too much. But if she's saying she never drank the brandy, then how would she think she's in enough of a daze to commit the murder? Sir John holds on to this point and goes back to the Markhams, who are the stage owners and live in a house that's nearby where the murder took place. In fact, they're so close they heard the screaming and initially stuck their heads out the window in a very kind of comical opening scene. From there, they do some investigating of their own. They go back to the scene of the crime, and they discuss things with the innkeeper. They discover that some of her testimony might have been a little faulty, and could lead to Diana's innocence. There's also a number of other things discovered, like the fact that the stage production uses police uniforms. Ducey Markham, who is Ted Markham's wife, had her head out the window and saw a policeman going by, and then a second police officer. But Sir John is thinking that the first police officer may never have been an actual police officer. It might have just been someone in the stage show who was using the police uniform. He finds out that there's 2 different uniforms for 2 different cast members, but it's only for one part. He also finds out from a different innkeeper, who was also taking in some of the stage workers, and he finds out that the youngest boy that lives there was hit by Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart is played by Donald Calthrop, who was in the film Blackmail. Anyways, he learns the reason the boy was hit was because he was digging around in the luggage and spotted the police uniform. And after the discovery of a bloody cigarette case that seemingly belongs to Stewart, that leads everyone back to Diana, who confirms that the cigarette case is actually not Stewart's. It belongs to a character named Fane, who also played one of the police officers. So, it's one or the other, but they conclude that it must be Fane, and through a Hamlet-like scenario, Sir John writes a fake play utilizing all the facts from the case, and leaves an ending to be written. He has Handel Fane come in to try out for the part, pretending to be the producer of some upcoming show, but as they read through the play, Fane only gets more and more suspicious about everything, especially since the ending is not written. He refuses to own up to anything and goes back to work at the circus. Because during this time, he's not just part of the stage show, he's also working for some circus as a trapeze artist. I don't really understand that, but I guess he mentions, hey, it's hard times, I have to have 2 jobs. It's a really random way to set up the finale, but it's all worth it. Basically, Sir John and Tad Markham go to watch this circus show. They see Fane as the trapeze artist climb up to the top, doing his show, but he's becoming more and more weary over the situation as the guilt begins to sink in. And then he hangs himself from the top of the tent. It's a fantastic scene. It plays out very slow, but you know exactly what's coming, and it's disturbing, and it works. After that, Sir John finds that Fane had completed the play by essentially writing his confession. A detailed list of how he committed the murder, how he walked in just as Diana was covering her ears, and he murdered poor Eden. He then took a sip of brandy and he ran out, using the police uniform as a disguise. With that confession, that frees Diana, and she's again working in the stage show, alongside Sir John. So we have a whodunit here, and that seems like the type of thing that would work best for Hitchcock, even though, as he's discussing in the Truffaut book, he's not a big fan of the whodunits. He feels that most audiences are just waiting for the culprit, rather than the actual production building up the suspense, which, of course, he's the master of suspense. That's what he's looking for. I do find that this murder itself is a bit unbelievable in the sense that the entire scenario it's hard to grasp. There's a conversation between Diana and Eden when they're staying at this innkeeper's home. While they're having the conversation, they start talking about a man and Diana doesn't want to hear it. She knows that Eden's basically talking crap about this person. She covers her ears, she closes her eyes, and then when she finally lets go, because she couldn't hear anything during that time, she opens her eyes to see that Eden was murdered. So that's why she doesn't quite understand what happened. She was in a bit of a daze, and that's why she says, it's possible I could have murdered her. In that exact moment, it was actually Fane who walked in and murdered Eden and then ran out. But before that, he also took a sip of the brandy. That's a lot to buy, though, that entire scenario that seems very unrealistic. And not that Hitchcock hasn't done things like that before, where there's such a tight bit of coincidence going on that it becomes almost implausible, but sometimes he's been able to make it work. In this case, it doesn't give a chance for the audience to work for themselves to figure out who possibly could have committed this murder, because this specific situation is so not realistic. It's almost impossible to guess what's going on. Another thing is that they don't really dig into much of the motivation for the murder. Even the Truffaut book mentions that Fane is the fiancé to Diana, and that Eden was about to tell Diana some dirt about Fane, which is why Fane ends up having to go in and kill Eden. But the movie never explicitly says that Handel Fane and Diana are engaged. As for the subtext, it's involving this idea that Fane himself is a homosexual or a cross-dresser. In a lot of the old readings, they kind of cross those over a lot. They also use the term transvestite, and even in the Truffaut book, that's what they specifically bring up, even though that was never anything that's in this movie, and it was never anything that was written in the book. In fact, they have a different reason. Basically, it's because Fane himself is a half-caste, which during that time was a term used for someone who's multiracial, someone who could pass off as white, but is in fact multiracial. And in most cases, it was people who were European, but also of Indian descent. Now, they only mention that one time. It's also an idea that stemmed a bit into racism, because the idea would be, since he's multiracial, he can't work in the stage production. But then there's also the case that he dresses up as a woman in the show. He also dresses up as a woman at the circus. So, does that play into it at all? Is it just because he's so much of a different type of person? There'd be enough bigotry going towards him if people found out he was also multiracial? It's very loosely brought up in the film, and this is on top of the fact that they don't really bring up that Diana and him are engaged. That's not really part of the story. I guess the idea is that if they were engaged, it would make sense why he went and killed Eden, but he didn't kill Diana, despite the fact that she was in the room. Even if she had her eyes covered and her ears covered, there'd still be good reason to kill Diana if you were worried that she somehow possibly saw you just murder Eden in that same room. But if they were engaged, it would make sense why he kept her alive. And in the German version, they do explicitly bring up the fact that he did love her, that he had a love for Diana. The names are changed in the German version, we'll get to that, but basically the equivalents of both films don't really have the same reasons brought up. The German equivalent of murder is titled Mary. The name of this film, which I have to say has a very awesome looking opening logo, comes from the name of the accused woman, Mary Baring, which was changed from the English version where the character's name was Diana Baring. This version runs a bit shorter, it's at 82 minutes, and a lot of the scenes are condensed for time, including the scene where the police go investigate them at the stage show. Instead of it dragging on and seeing a lot of the characters pop in and out, a lot of the funny moments are cut down. That also includes the opening scene where the Markhams first discover that a murder occurred. In the English version, this is played out a lot longer, but in the German version, they very quickly leave the house to go see what happened. And it's kind of hard to compare these two films because, like I said, it's the same director and a lot of the shot sequences are basically the same. Hitchcock did mention that he didn't have a good enough grasp of the German language, so some of the humor that's in the English version doesn't necessarily carry over because he doesn't have the best idea of German enunciations and how to make the phrases funny. Everything plays out the same, except when Sir John writes the play for Handel Fane to read and hopefully confess to the murder. That scene's played out a lot angrier than it is in the English version, which wouldn't that lead Handel Fane to be aware that Sir John is onto them? I like the more mysterious aspect of the English version. I like that he keeps his temper more. I think there's more of a terror to go on if Handel Fane doesn't quite know what Sir John's getting at. The only major difference, it's kind of weird. Mary has a slightly different ending from Murder. Not in terms of plot or storyline, but just the way the films end. So Murder originally had an alternative ending, which is available on the Kino Blu-ray. In the original ending, basically, it's not much different. Diana is released from prison, and she joins Sir John at his home. He mentions, hey, now you can be in my stage show, and then they cut to the play, which is the original ending of the movie. And possibly it's the same play about the murder that he had Handel Fane read. Whereas in Mary, it actually includes this alternative scene as the final scene of the movie. It's Diana, or at least in this film, the equivalent is Mary, being at Sir John's home. That's it. There is no final scene of a play. So I don't really know why that change was done. It's a little odd, because I like the fact that they ended on a play. It kind of reminds me of a Hitchcock ending anyway, but Mary doesn't. It's kind of a depressive note, and that's it. Like I said, some of the character names are the same in both versions. Both versions, the main character, Sir John, is the same. And in both versions, the actual murderer is named Handel Fane. In the English version, Sir John is played by Herbert Marshall, and in the German version, he's played by Alfred Abel, who is most famous for starring in the film Metropolis. In the English version, the stage producer is named Ted Markham, and he's played by Edward Chapman, who was also in Juno and the Paycock. But in the German version, this character's name is Bobby Brown, and it's played by Paul Graetz. His wife in the German version is named Bebe Brown, so we have Bobby Brown and Bebe Brown, and she's played by Lottie Stein, whereas in the English version, the name of Ted's wife is Juicy Markham, and she's played by Phyllis Constam. The accused woman is named Diana Baring in the English version, played by Nora Baring, and in the German version, it's Mary Baring, played by Olga Teschauer. And in both versions, the character they believed the cigarette box originally belonged to, Stuart, is the same in both versions, except it's spelled differently. In the English version, it's Stewart, whereas in the German version, it's Stuart. In the German version, he's played by John Mylong, and in the English version, it's played by Donald Calthrop, who was from the film Blackmail. Murder runs at about an hour and 44 minutes, and Mary runs at 82 minutes. I don't really know why Mary was released in 1931, whereas Murder was released in 1930, but my only assumption is that production took a little bit longer on Mary, or possibly they just had a delayed release when it was inevitably only released in Germany. There's also a Hitchcock cameo in Murder. He's walking outside the home where the murder took place when Markham and Sir John go to revisit it. I should also mention for the Kino Blu-ray release, it has excellent picture, but the only problem is it's in a 1.33 by 1 aspect ratio, which seemed fine, except there was a couple moments where it looked like some of the sides had filming equipment showing up, or the ends of the stage were visible. Well, then I found out through Brenton Films that yes, this actually had a 1.19 by 1 aspect ratio. Nothing is vertically or horizontally squeezed this time around, but unfortunately, they left too much of the picture in there that was not originally intended by cinematographer Jackie Cox. So overall, with a film titled Murder from Hitchcock, I was expecting a little bit more than what I got. It's a whodunit that, for the most part, has an excellent cast. Herbert Marshall gives a wonderful portrayal of Sir John, and I like that he teams up with the Markhams to figure out who truly committed this murder. I like some of the scenes, like at the courthouse, especially when the jury is deliberating. I like some of the utilization of sounds, like when there's a voiceover in Sir John's head as music's playing on his radio. I also like some of the interesting ways that some of the scenes are shot. Like, for instance, when Sir John goes to visit Diana in prison, it's all done in a very flat-looking way where we're looking straight on at the character from the ends of the table. It's not the normal 180-degree rule where we're looking over the shoulder of both characters. Instead, we're looking dead on at just them at the end of a very long table that takes up the bottom 25% of the screen. I think it's just a cool angle that a lot of people don't go for nowadays. However, there's not as many Hitchcock-filled moments like there was in Blackmail or some of his better silent films. And some of the stuff that he's trying to make into something just doesn't work. Like, one of the characters is walking on a carpet, but the carpet is clearly on this foam-looking ground. Like, it's not a solid floor. It's almost like he's walking on a bunch of pillows. I guess this is meant to mean that the character's on shaky ground or something like that. Honestly, watching it nowadays, I think most of the audience is just waiting for whatever's under the carpet to be revealed, like it's going to play into the plot, but it never does. It's only there to, I guess, develop the character's emotion for the audience somehow, but it just doesn't work. I don't really know what that scene is there for. And unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot to say about Mary, because since they use the same sets and sometimes the exact same shots and even some of the exact same footage, I don't really know how to differentiate between the two unless you're talking about the German actors. But just like Hitchcock, I don't know the German language. I don't know exactly what the German actors are bringing when compared to the English actors. So overall, I would give Murder 3 out of 5 stars, and I guess Mary would get the same rating, but like I said, I don't even really know how to rate that film. And unfortunately, it's just a whodunit that I don't think lands as well as some other Hitchcock movies. But nonetheless, it's entertaining. And with that, we'll end things for this episode as we look forward to next week as we go back to the Kino Blu-ray collection one last time to discuss The Skin Game, released in 1931. Thanks for listening to this episode. Let me know your thoughts on Murder, Mary, and some other Hitchcock films, Hitchcock himself. If you had a comment, question, or suggestion to this episode, I will do a shout out next time. Thanks so much for joining me on this year-long journey, and we'll see you next time.
This concludes my part of the program. Next time, I shall return with another story.